Since his debut in the mid to late 90s, Busta Rhymes pioneered the way for an avant-garde style and approach to hip-hop that gets overlooked by most people only recognizing him as a speed rapper. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about Busta Rhymes and break down and analyze one of my favorite albums by him, Genesis. Genesis was released in November 2001. Thanks to the strength of Patrick Rossier Part 2 and Break a Neck, the album debuted at number 7 on the Billboard 100 and sold 1 million copies in the US and reached platinum. Before I start analyzing and breaking down the album, I want to talk a little bit about Busta Rhymes' journey in hip-hop. Busta Rhymes was born in Brooklyn and was introduced to hip-hop at a very young age. He went to school with Jay-Z and Biggie and even used to have rap battles with Jay-Z at school. In 1986, Busta Rhymes, who I think was maybe around 14 to 15 years old at the time, joined a trio group called Leaders of the New School, who would be mentored by and open for Public Enemy. Chuck D was Busta Rhymes and Leaders of the New School's mentor and gave Busta Rhymes his name inspired by the 1980s football player George Buster Rhymes. By the age of 17 in 1989, Busta Rhymes and Leaders of the New School would sign with Elektra Records and release their first album in 1991 called A Future Without a Past. From then on, the group continued to grow their reputation and was famously known for being part of the Native Tongues, a rap collective that featured iconic hip-hop groups from the 90s like A Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul, and many more. Busta Rhymes and Leaders of the New School would then appear on A Tribe Called Quest's Scenario. From that moment, Busta Rhymes especially stood out from Leaders of the New School due to his unique rap style and would then go on to be featured on many iconic songs and work with some of the biggest artists in hip-hop like Biggie, Brand Nubian, KSR1, Old Dirty Bastard, and work with R&B acts such as Mary J. Blige and TLC. Eventually, Leaders of the New School broke up and Busta Rhymes would continue on his solo ventures, debuting his first album in 1996, The Coming. I want to add a bit more context and emphasis about how integral it was for Busta Rhymes to have Chuck D from Public Enemy be his mentor. I spoke about Public Enemy in my previous video, and not only were they major icons in hip-hop and political rap, but they continuously gave back to their community and helped grow hip-hop in immense ways. Being mentored by Public Enemy helped shape Busta Rhymes' early career and gave him the foundations and teachings on how to be a good overall recording artist through the concept of clamp, which we can thank for what inspired Busta Rhymes to bring such grand, dramatic, theatrical, and avant-garde concepts within the world of hip-hop. In his Thanks To section of the Genesis album, Busta Rhymes gives thanks to Chuck D and Pete Rock and directly mentions Clamp. You and Pete were the originators of a classic which I now call Shut 'Em Down 2002. This remake is a tribute to you. Thank you for being such an incredible force in my life. You are one of the most influential figures in hip-hop and I attribute much of why I've grown into to what you've taught me. You gave me my name and you gave me a thorough understanding of what it means to be a well-rounded recording artist, Clamp, which I still apply to this day. Clamp stands for concept, lyrics, attitude/appearance, music, and performance. Chuck D taught Busta Rhymes that without all these elements, you won't have the clamp on your shit or work. And if you look at Busta Rhymes' growth since his debut and mentorship with Public Enemy, you can see how all the elements of clamp were integrated and applied to his music, persona, style, visuals, and performance. He came onto the scene with a very powerful, playful, and theatrical presence and style that separated him from Leaders of the New School and many other upcoming rappers in the late 90s and early 2000s. Lyrically and aesthetically, he's equally playful and humorous as he was diabolical and volatile. In his technical rap style, he stood out by his raspy voice, the heavy and powerful use of onomatopoeias, and of course, speed rapping. He matched his unique style of rapping with a larger-than-life visual presence. He's delivered an insane amount of iconic music videos, is a blueprint in hip-hop's fashion, and built an unshakable persona. I also believe that Busta Rhymes uses contrast really well in his work. While his raps are loud, chaotic, crazy, and even play with dark themes such as destruction, chaos, and anarchy, he delivers and presents these themes in ways that are really animated, colorful, theatrical, humorous, and in your face. Literally. These elements are what I believe made Busta Rhymes such a success amongst his peers. He operates on a paradoxical level that leaves a really strong, lasting impression to his listeners. In speaking on his creative process, Busta Rhymes had said in an interview that his grand and explosive visual styles and ideas all begin from after he makes his songs. From the feelings that he gets from his songs, he creates a visual that complements the sound so that his listeners can see what they're hearing. He explained that he wants his listeners to see and feel what the music is making him feel based on what he's hearing. Busta Rhymes had a really interesting concept when he first debuted. He followed a biblical and chaotic theme of apocalypse in his albums. His first album was titled The Coming, and it was released in 1996. Since then, he continued to make albums with an underlying sense of apocalyptic eeriness, as if something disastrous was going to happen to the world or society. Of course, being that these albums were produced in the late 90s, I feel like this was all alluding to the big, Y2K end of the world theory, where people believe that once we reach the year 2000, the world would end. If you listen to Extinction Level Event, The Final World's Front intro, you can kind of catch a hint of this. So Busta Rhymes continued to release albums with these feelings of impending doom until we reached the year 2000 and the world didn't end, and then it seemed like these apocalyptic themes had run its course. Now, I'm not sure if Busta Rhymes had an ulterior name for the Genesis album. I mean, Anarchy did get released in the year 2000 after the world was supposedly supposed to end. However, something did happen in 2001 that would bring the running apocalyptic theme of Busta Rhymes' albums to a halt, which was 9/11. Although Busta Rhymes did have a very chaotic and threatening tone to his titles and themes of his albums, one thing about them that made them so powerful was that they were all biblical references. But like more of the like end of the world type biblical, like where you have to repent for your sins and like the end is coming. I mean, like even in the inner sleeve of the Genesis album, like he's literally pictured in a church. However, choosing Genesis as the album title, especially after 9/11, was practically genius. The title Genesis refers to the first book of the Bible, Genesis 1, which most of us are familiar with, even if you've never read the Bible. It starts with the iconic phrase, "In the beginning, God created heaven and the earth." The book is overall about God's creation of the earth, its origins, and the beginning of all things and the world as we know it. After a long run of chaotic theme titled albums, we get the sense that Genesis symbolizes the origin of a new beginning for Busta Rhymes, his sound, and the world around him. I also believe that after 9/11, it would have been ill-fitting or insensitive to have released an album with another apocalyptic theme. And again, Busta Rhymes also indirectly mentions and alludes to 9/11 in his Thanks You section of the Genesis album, where he wrote in bolded words, "And finally, blessings to the victims and families of the tragedy that has come to pass. My heartfelt sympathy goes out to each and every one of you as we begin to rebuild our cities and our lives. Let's do so with a newfound commitment and focus on empowering one another as a people. This is our Genesis, our time for rebirth, our destiny. From the street corners to the suburbs to the cities and beyond, I salute you all. One." Even without considering 9/11, the Y2K millennium was still a big topic back then, especially with the end of the world theory. Busta Rhymes had said in an interview with MTV that he doesn't feel like the year 2000 is the year all hell breaks loose, but I feel like in every holy scripture, it has been predicted that this time would be a significant time. So there's definitely a spiritual and religious influence behind Busta Rhymes. You can see this from the very obvious biblical motifs within his discography. The title and theme of Genesis didn't just signify a new rebirth for Busta Rhymes and his sound, but also a turning point for the world and society. Funny enough, it also kind of prophesized the change that was happening in hip-hop as it entered the early 2000s. At the time of Genesis' release, hip-hop was going through a major change. After the success of some of the biggest rap stars in the 90s, like NWA, Jay-Z, Tupac, and Biggie, hip-hop was becoming more commercialized than ever. Technically, hip-hop started to go commercial in the mid to late 90s. However, after the Y2K era hit, hip-hop was commercialized nationwide. The genre was in a league of its own and was a huge sensation. Not only were people listening to hip-hop, but were getting interest in the culture and especially the look of hip-hop and what rappers, video vixens, and honestly just what black people were wearing. Busta Rhymes is an icon in fashion and hip-hop. His colorful and eccentric music videos and visuals were accompanied with out-of-this-world fashion looks. He routinely covered himself in full body paint, adorned huge jackets, Timberlands, and grills. Another big part of his look was his amazing various hairstyles, which added on to his big personality. His music videos, some directed by the infamous Hype Williams, were a pinnacle piece of what hip-hop looked like at the time. Fun, futuristic, colorful, exciting, provocative, and sometimes kind of scary. The commercialization of hip-hop also changed its sound, especially with producers having now access to new technology that included software, hardware, and new sounds to play with. With this commercialization and access to technology, hip-hop now had the opportunity to merge its sound with other genres that were getting massive radio play, like pop and R&B, which is why so many of those genres had rap features at the time. Recognizing how lucrative radio play was, hip-hop started to capitalize off this success and beginning to incorporate other elements from genres into its sound. Albums began to feature more melodies and catchier lyrics, especially with the inclusion of choruses and hooks. Hip-hop began to move away from pure rap verses and beats, and lyrics became less politically charged. Genesis clearly shows this shift when comparing it to some of Busta Rhymes' earlier work. It included features with R&B singers such as Khalees and Mary J. Blige, who were huge in the Y2K era, and has a lot of repetitive choruses. There was also a running capitalistic theme. For example, most obviously, Plastic Forcier Part 1 and 2, which runs like an advertisement for cognac. Basically, the cognac industry was failing, and they signed deals with rappers to include cognac in their music videos and songs. This change in the sound of hip-hop isn't necessarily a bad thing. It was just a basic formula for songs in the Y2K era, not even limited to the hip-hop sound in general. Pop and R&B also had this similar shift. Additionally, that very iconic Y2K futuristic aesthetic was also a way of subconsciously selling people a dreamy future where technological devices were indicators of wealth and class. So now I want to discuss my favorite part of the album, which is its sound. Some of the most iconic producers of the Y2K era, such as J Dilla, Dr. Dre, the Neptunes, produced many songs on the Genesis album. The production lineup on this album is very strong, but the sound style of this album sounds very different from what Busta Rhymes had put out previously, and I think this fits in really well with the Genesis rebirth concept. Busta Rhymes is still consistent with his rap style, loud, raspy, fast, over the top, and humorous as ever, but now with a new digital Y2K touch. I can only think of the idea of Busta's rebirth being that now he's fully injected himself into the technological era that the whole world was entering into in the 2000s. Since hip-hop was entering new heights of popularity, producers began to take the traditional sound of hip-hop and fuse it with other genres such as techno, which you can very prominently hear on this album. I always describe this album as sounding kind of hypergalactic, spaceshipy, and that is because of the heavy use of synths and, again, techno elements. So my favorite examples of this are in Everybody Rise Again, Holla, and Make It Hurt. Even though there's lots of use of synths on this album, they're used in darker tones, which makes the overall sound of the album a little bit more menacing or like horror movie-like. So Holla, Bad Dreams, Bounce, You Ain't Fucking With Me, Truck Volume are all really good examples of this. Even though there are darker tones to this album that make it sound menacing and horror-like, the overall album is still really energetic and hyperactive and fun, and this is because there's a lot of high-tempo keyboard loops in the album. The looping of high-tempo keyboard notes was a major stylistic element of 2000s hip-hop, where rapping over a looping keyboard note was key to making a memorizable and catchy song that was perfect for radio play. And obviously, with Dre on the album, there are significant bass-heavy G-funk moments, and the Neptunes provided some electro-funk elements, most notably on What It Is featuring Khalees and Plastic Forcier Part 2. Vocal layering is also a huge part of this album. I can't emphasize enough how much of a master Busta Rhymes is in using vocal layering with his already very boisterous voice. Whether he appears on a track by himself, with a feature, or with the Flipmore Squad, the use of vocal layering adds depth and impact and makes it easier for listeners to follow along and sing and dance to, especially given that Busta Rhymes speed raps for a lot of his verses. Having those moments of vocal layering applied to specific words on the song with a dark high-tempo beat in the background really makes the song sound really dynamic and strikes its listeners. You can see the use of vocal layering in Break Your Neck, where certain parts or words of the song are repeated with that extra layer. For example, in the second verse where he says troops on and boots on, you can hear the first layer of him rapping and then a second layer which sounds like there are two Busta Rhymes on a track. In a weird way, it kind of sounds a little bit schizophrenic, like to have 2 or 3 different Busta Rhymes on a track. But you can also hear another example of vocal layering on Everybody Rise Again, where Busta Rhymes' vocals are layered on top of each other to create this kind of like gospel church-like effect, which I think only further emphasizes, again, like that biblical motive between the album and his past discography. Finally, Busta Rhymes also uses a call and response style in his tracks. You can hear this in Break Your Neck where he goes back and forth with himself saying come on, and you can also hear this in Better Stay Up In Your House with Raw Digga where they go back and forth with each other. One of my favorite uses of vocal layering and the call and response style merged together beautifully in one song is in the song You Ain't Fucking With Me, which is such a fun, hyperactive song to listen to. The use of these stylistic elements is really important to note. One of the major criticisms that we have with modern day hip hop is that it sounds really linear because we don't have that same group dynamic that was really popular in the 80s and 90s and I guess 2000s hip hop. I think Busta Rhymes' use of vocal layering and the call and response style is a really good example of how even if you're just one rapper on a track, you can still make your song sound like it has a lot of depth to it. I don't think there are any major encompassing messages in this album, but rather a concept that Busta Rhymes is trying to embody and communicate. If you look at his past 4 albums before Genesis, all 4 connect together to form a story that surrounds the end of the world theory, which reaches its epiphany with the Anarchy album released in 2000. One easy way to see this narrative is by listening to the intro and outro skits on Busta Rhymes' albums. The outro to Anarchy should lead into the intro to Genesis, however, the outro to Anarchy is really diabolical and evil sounding, and then the intro to Genesis is completely opposite to that, where Busta Rhymes sounds really calm. Again, this just ties into the whole rebirth Genesis concept. Speaking on skits, the Genesis album has a lot of intro and outro skits that are attached onto the end of some of the songs within the album that help weave and merge them together. This is a practice that I really miss in albums because it made the full listening experience from an album from start to finish more enjoyable and exciting, kind of like you're following the artist through a movie or a story. For example, Shut 'Em Down 2002 leads into Genesis with that hook that interpolates Cosmic Mind Affair by Aquafragile in the background of J Dilla's beat. One of my favorite examples is We Got What You Want leading into Truck Volume. Holla leads into Wife in Law, which then amazingly leads into Ass on Your Shoulders. And finally, Match the Name of the Voice leads into Bad Dreams. Speaking of bad dreams, one of the major motives in this album is the use of biblical references. Again, this all directly relates to the title of the album, Genesis. Bad Dreams, Genesis, Everybody Rise Again, Holla, all kind of had like this biblical tone to its lyrics and sound. There's also this thing that Busta Rhymes does in his songs where he's calling out different groups of people, whether it's like men, women, east side, west side, or different states. And it really reminded me of how church pastors would call out people to rise up to like really feel something. And I guess in this case, Busta Rhymes is kind of doing the same thing where he's calling out people to like rise up and listen to his music or to dance or, you know. And then finally, I just want to list out some really obvious references in the tracks. As I Come Back gives an ode to A Tribe Called Quest's Scenario, which Busta Rhymes had featured on. Shut 'Em Down 2002 is a very obvious ode to Public Enemy's Shut 'Em Down. And Everybody Rise Again is a sequel to the song Everybody Rise off the Anarchy album. So the cover of the album is Busta Rhymes looking down with his hand over his chest. However, this image of Busta Rhymes is being put together through other images, which I think kind of leads into that whole Genesis idea. Like, the word Genesis basically means the mode of formation of something or the origin. So it just seems like a new Busta Rhymes is basically being put together with the way that the images all kind of puzzle piece together to make this bigger image. Before this, Busta Rhymes' artwork was more bolder and chaotic, either including heavily contrasting fiery colors, symbolism, or him looking literally possessed. The Genesis cover is strikingly different from his past style of album covers, further solidifying the idea that Genesis is a new Busta Rhymes like we've never seen before. So here's the thing, even though this album has a lot of iconic Y2K futuristic visuals, sound elements that merge genres and new sound styles together, and themes such as the taboo use of biblical references, which usually stirs up strong feelings in audiences, this album doesn't really get mentioned a lot. It's quite a shame, to be honest, because that futuristic hip-hop sound that was iconic from the Y2K era is fully embodied in this album, but doesn't get mentioned as much as like to the likes of maybe Missy Elliott, for example. I feel like if it wasn't for Break Your Neck or Plastic Divorcier Part 2, this album might not have performed as well. I mean, when they did the repress of this album, they actually removed Ass on Your Shoulders and put in Plastic Divorcier Part 2, which I think is because Plastic Divorcier was just a popular single and they wanted the album to, you know, get more sales. As the Y2K trend continues, I think it might start to die out, I'm not sure. But while it is still trending, and as we as a society continue to move into a new technological era with like AI and all that shit, I really do hope that like this sound style kind of reemerges and that Busta Rhymes and this album receive their flowers for being such an amazing album from that time. But yeah, thank you for watching this video. I really love this album. It's one of my favorite albums ever. I even have a poster of this album. But yeah, thank you for watching. I like to talk about music and movies all the time, so I appreciate it if you made it this far.